Story number 1. Archive Request. I found the request form at 9:53 on Thursday night. It came through the online portal at 9:47 in the evening, 20 minutes after I'd locked the main doors and sent the student workers home. A patron request for restricted materials. Civil War correspondence, Massachusetts infantry records, the kind of documents we keep in the basement archive behind 2 locked doors. The system showed the request came from Professor Chen's account. He did this sometimes, submitted forms remotely when he was working from home, expected them processed by morning. I'd been staying late anyway, trying to clear the backlog before the semester rush. The building was mine until midnight when the security sweep came through. I took my master key ring and headed for the basement stairs. The smell hit me before I reached the archive door. That familiar mustiness of old paper and leather bindings, but underneath it something sharp and chemical. Fresh cigarette smoke. I stopped on the bottom step and listened. The basement was supposed to be empty. We had smoke detectors. Nobody smoked in the building. I told myself maintenance had been down here earlier. Sometimes they propped the emergency exit open when they were moving equipment. The smell could have drifted in from outside. The archive door was unlocked. Not just unlocked, slightly ajar. 6 inches of darkness beyond the frame. I pushed it open slowly. The lights were on in the front section, the reading table and catalogue cabinets visible and untouched. But the narrow aisles between the tall shelving units stretched back into shadow, and I heard footsteps. Deliberate, measured, moving between the stacks in the restricted section at the far end. "Hello?" My voice sounded thin in the close air. "Professor Chen?" The footsteps stopped. I stood in the doorway, key ring heavy in my hand, and waited for a response. For someone to emerge from between the shelves looking embarrassed, explaining they'd gotten locked in, that they'd called facilities for help. But there was only silence. Complete silence. Not even the sound of breathing. Then the lights went out in the back section. Click. Darkness swallowed the far end of the room. I took a step backward. "The building is closed. You need to identify yourself." Another section went dark. Closer now. The lights were on a grid, controlled by switches mounted on the support columns every 20 feet. Someone was moving forward through the aisles, systematically turning off each section as they advanced. My hand found my phone. I pulled it out, thumbs shaking as I unlocked the screen. The light from it seemed impossibly bright in the dimming room. Another click. The middle section went dark. I could see him now. A shape between 2 shelving units, standing motionless in the last pool of light before the front section where I stood. He wore coveralls, dark blue maintenance coveralls with something printed on the chest pocket. I couldn't read from this distance. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. "I'm calling security." I kept my voice steady, but I was backing toward the door, one slow step at a time. He didn't respond, didn't move. The light from my phone screen caught his face for a moment. Middle-aged maybe, ordinary features, the kind of face you'd pass in a hallway and forget immediately. But his eyes stayed fixed on mine with an intensity that made my stomach drop. I reached behind me for the door frame. My keychain was in my other hand, and I found the small panic button on the ring by touch. The one campus security had issued to all staff after the incident in the science building last year. I pressed it twice, felt it vibrate once to confirm the silent alarm. 4 minutes. That's what they'd told us. 4 minutes average response time. The man took a step forward. I moved behind the tall filing cabinet just inside the door, putting the metal bulk between us. My supply pouch was still clipped to my belt from earlier when I'd been repairing torn dust jackets. I fumbled it open and pulled out the box cutter, extended the blade with my thumb. The small sound of the blade locking seemed enormous. The footsteps resumed, slow, searching. He was moving through the front section now, checking the aisles methodically. I could hear him displacing air as he moved, hear the soft scrape of his coveralls against the shelving units. I crouched lower behind the cabinet, phone clutched in one hand, box cutter in the other. The screen was still on, casting faint light across the floor. I tilted it against my chest to hide the glow. He was close now, maybe 10 feet away. I could hear his breathing, steady and calm. Could smell that cigarette smoke, smell mixed with sweat and something else. Dust. Old paper dust ground into fabric. My legs were cramping. I shifted my weight slightly and my shoes scraped against the concrete floor. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, counted seconds in my head. 10, 20, 30. Then I heard the emergency exit bar click at the far end of the room. The alarm should have sounded, the piercing shriek that was supposed to alert the whole building. But there was only silence and the sound of the door opening, closing. I stayed behind the cabinet, didn't move. Couldn't make myself move. The security team found me there 4 minutes later, still crouched with the box cutter in my hand. 3 officers, flashlights cutting through the darkness. They'd found the emergency exit standing open, the alarm disabled. Wire cutters left on the floor beneath the control panel, the wires neatly severed. The security director, Marcus, walked me upstairs to his office, made me drink water from a paper cup while he pulled up the camera feeds. He didn't ask many questions, just let me sit there shaking while he scrolled through the footage. There, he said quietly. The timestamp read 3:12 in the afternoon. The main entrance camera showed a man in maintenance coveralls entering through the front doors. He held up an ID card to the reader. The system logged it as Professor Chen's faculty card. The man's face was visible for just a moment as he looked up at the camera, the same ordinary features I'd seen between the shelving units. Then he walked toward the stacks and disappeared from view. Marcus scrolled forward. 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock. The man never appeared on any other camera, not in the reading rooms, not at the circulation desk, not leaving through any exit. He was in the building for 6 hours, Marcus said, just waiting. The request form was still open on my computer upstairs. Professor Chen's account. But when Marcus called him, the professor was at a conference in Vermont. Had been there since Tuesday. Hadn't submitted any requests. Hadn't used his faculty ID since Monday morning. They found the card reader in the parking lot 2 days later, wedged behind a dumpster, a portable skimmer, the kind that copies magnetic strips. They never found the man. I still work at the library. Still process requests. But I don't stay late anymore, and I never go down to the archive alone. Sometimes I think about those 6 hours he spent in the building, moving through the stacks while students studied upstairs, while I sat at my desk processing forms. Just waiting for the building to empty, waiting for me to come down those stairs. The request form is still in the system. Nobody can figure out how to delete it. It just sits there in the queue, submitted at 9:47 in the evening, waiting to be processed. Story number 2. Dock light. I woke up at 5:30 in the morning like I always do. The sky was grey and flat, the kind of overcast that makes the lake look like sheet metal. I pulled on my boots and walked down to the dock with my thermos, same as every other morning for the past 11 years. The boat was there. Of course it was there. But something looked off. I stopped at the edge of the dock and stared at the bowline. It was tied with a cleat hitch, the rope wrapped twice around the cleat and finished with a loop. Clean. Secure. Completely wrong. I always use a bowline. Always. My father taught me that knot when I was 8 years old, and I have tied it the same way every single night since I inherited this property. Muscle memory. I could tie it in my sleep. I stood there for a long moment, holding my thermos, trying to make sense of it. The wind had been strong the night before. Maybe the line had come loose, and I had retied it in the dark without thinking. Maybe I was more tired than I realized. I worked long days. 14, 16 hours on the water. It was possible. I stepped onto the boat and checked the deck. Everything looked normal. The nets were stowed. The cooler was latched. I opened the hatch to the small storage cabin below deck, just to make sure nothing had shifted or gotten wet. That is when I saw the sleeping bag. It was rolled up tight and shoved against the far wall behind the life jackets. Dark blue. Synthetic. Not mine. I only keep wool blankets on board, the old heavy kind that smell like lanolin and lake water. This was new, clean. Next to it were food wrappers, granola bar, beef jerky, a flattened energy drink can. I picked up the granola bar wrapper and checked the date printed on the corner. 4 days ago. I had not been in this cabin in over a week. My chest felt tight. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone had engine trouble and tied up here overnight. Maybe they left in a hurry and forgot their gear. It happens. People get careless. But the smell hit me then. Sharp, chemical, citrus and something else, something astringent. Deodorant. The kind that comes in a white stick and leaves a waxy residue. I do not use deodorant like that. I use unscented gel. The smell was so strong in that confined space it made my eyes water. Someone had been living in here, sleeping in here. Recently. I backed out of the cabin and stood on the deck, breathing hard. The lake was empty. The trees along the shore were still. I looked toward my house, 100 yards up the slope. The windows were dark. I needed to move the boat closer to shore. I needed to see if anything else was missing or moved. I climbed to the stern and turned the key in the outboard motor. It clicked. Nothing. I tried again. Same thing. No turnover, no spark. I opened the cowling with shaking hands. The engine looked fine. Fuel line was connected. Battery cables were tight. Then I saw the spark plug wires. They were still attached, but when I unscrewed the first plug, the socket was empty. I checked the other two. All 3 spark plugs were gone. Someone had taken them. Someone had deliberately disabled my boat. I climbed back onto the dock and looked around. The shore was rocky and uneven, covered with old tarps and equipment I had been meaning to move for months. I started lifting tarps, checking under crates, moving aside coils of rope. I found the spark plugs under a torn blue tarp near the far piling. All 3 of them, lined up in a row, placed carefully where I would not think to look unless I was searching. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped them. This was not an accident. This was not someone passing through. Someone had been here. Someone had been on my property, in my boat. And they did not want me to leave. I walked back to the dock box and opened it. The marine radio was inside, wrapped in plastic. I turned it on and waited for it to crackle to life. My voice did not sound like my own when I spoke. Harbor Patrol, this is Private Dock 7 on the North Shore. I need to report a trespasser. Someone has been living in my boat. Over. The response came back after a long pause. They were 15 miles south. It would take them at least 40 minutes to reach me by water, maybe longer depending on the wind. They told me to stay visible. Stay safe. Do not approach anyone. I took the flare gun from the dock box and checked the load. 1 flare. I kept it in my hand and sat down on the dock with my back to the lake, facing both the boat and my house. I could see everything from here. If someone moved, I would see them. The waiting was the worst part. My mind kept turning over the details. The knot, the sleeping bag, the smell. The spark plugs hidden just far enough away that I would waste time looking. Whoever did this knew the property, knew my routine, knew I would come down to the dock at dawn. I tried to think of who it could be. A drifter, a squatter, someone who saw the property from the water and thought it was abandoned. But the dock is private. The lake is remote. You do not just stumble onto this place. I looked at the boat. The logbook was in the cabin, tucked into the shelf above the navigation panel. I keep it there to track fuel and maintenance. I had not checked it in days. I stood up and walked back onto the boat, keeping the flare gun in my hand. I opened the cabin hatch and reached for the logbook. It was right where I left it, the cover warped from humidity. I flipped it open to check the last few entries. 4 Polaroid photographs slid out onto the deck. I stared at them. My brain could not process what I was seeing. Each photo showed the same thing. Me, asleep, in my bed. The first one was taken from the doorway of my bedroom, the second from the foot of the bed, the third from the window, the fourth from the side, close enough that I could see the detail in the quilt my mother made. The photos were recent. I recognized the shirt I had been wearing, the book on the nightstand, the glass of water. These were taken within the past week. Someone had been inside my house. While I was sleeping, multiple times, I dropped the logbook. The flare gun felt useless in my hand. I looked toward the house again, and this time the windows did not look dark. They looked like eyes, watching. I stayed on the dock. I did not move. The harbor patrol radio crackled with static, but I did not hear what they said. I just kept staring at those photos, trying to understand how someone could stand that close to me that many times, and I never woke up. The lake was silent. The sky stayed gray, and I realized I did not know when they would come back. Story number 3, Terminal Restroom. I finished my shift at 6 in the morning and drove straight to the bus terminal in Marietta. The next assignment didn't start until Monday, so I had 3 days to get to Lexington and find temporary housing. I'd been awake for 22 hours. My eyes felt gritty and my neck ached from leaning over patients all night. The terminal was nearly empty when I arrived just after 4. One man sat in the waiting area near the vending machines, head down, scrolling through his phone. The ticket counter was open, but the employee had her back turned, restocking something on the shelves behind her. My bus wouldn't board for another hour and 40 minutes. I dragged my suitcase toward the restrooms at the far end of the building. The wheels made a rhythmic clicking sound against the tile that echoed too loudly in the quiet space. I left my luggage just outside the women's restroom door where I could see it and went inside. The bathroom was older, institutional. White tile and grey stalls with that particular smell of industrial cleaner that never quite covers the underlying mustiness. 3 stalls total. I walked past the first 2 and entered the one at the far end, the furthest from the door. The fluorescent light directly above my stall was flickering, not constantly, but in irregular intervals that made my already tired eyes strain. I could hear it buzzing, a sound that seemed to pulse in time with the flicker. The lock mechanism felt loose when I slid it closed. The metal was worn smooth and it didn't click into place with any real firmness. I jiggled it once to make sure it had caught. I sat down and closed my eyes for a moment. The exhaustion was the kind that made my thoughts feel slow and sticky. I told myself I'd feel better after I got some coffee. There had to be a vending machine with something drinkable. The restroom door opened. I opened my eyes. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, not the quick pace of someone in a hurry. The steps moved across the tile and then stopped. I looked down at the gap beneath the stall door. A shadow. 2 feet, standing directly outside my stall, not moving toward the other stalls. Not moving at all. I waited. The fluorescent light buzzed and flickered above me. The feet didn't move. My heart started beating faster. I told myself it was nothing, maybe someone waiting for a stall. But there were 2 other empty stalls. I could see under the partitions. No one else was in here. I cleared my throat softly, thinking maybe that would prompt whoever it was to move along, to pick a different stall, to do something normal. The shadow remained motionless. Then I heard a small metallic sound. A click. The lock slid open. I hadn't touched it. I was sitting perfectly still, hands in my lap. But the lock had moved on its own, sliding out of the bracket and hanging loose. I lunged forward and grabbed the door, holding it shut with my hand pressed flat against the cold metal. My pulse was hammering now. The mechanism was old, I told myself. It finally gave out. These things happen in old buildings. But I could still see the shadow under the door, still standing there, not moving. I stared at that shadow and tried to make sense of it, tried to find a rational explanation. The light was flickering. Maybe it was creating strange shadows. Maybe no one was actually there. Then something slid under the door, a piece of paper, white, folded in half. I didn't want to pick it up. Every instinct told me not to touch it, but I did. My hands were shaking as I unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, printed in blue ink. Blue suitcase, grey jacket, hospital logo on the bag. My luggage was blue, my jacket was grey. My work bag had the hospital system logo printed on the front, and I'd left it sitting on top of my suitcase outside the restroom door where anyone could see it. I couldn't breathe properly. My chest felt tight. The shadow under the door hadn't moved. I screamed. I screamed as loud as I could and threw my full weight against the door, shoving it open with everything I had. It flew outward, and I stumbled forward, nearly falling. A man stood there. 40s maybe, average height, wearing jeans and a dark jacket. His face was completely expressionless. He didn't step back, didn't react to the door hitting him, just stood there looking at me. I ran. I shoved past him and sprinted toward the exit. My shoes slapped against the tile. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and panicked. I didn't look back. The ticket counter. I ran straight to it. The employee turned around, startled by the sound of me running. "There's someone in the bathroom," I said. My voice didn't sound like my own. "There's a man. He was in the women's restroom. He was standing outside my stall." She stared at me for a second, then picked up a phone and made a call. 2 security guards arrived within minutes. They asked me questions while one of them went to check the restrooms. I tried to explain about the lock, about the note, about the shadow under the door. I showed them the piece of paper, still clutched in my hand. The guard came back and said the restrooms were empty, no one inside. They searched the terminal. The man I'd seen was gone. The other person who'd been sitting in the waiting area was gone too, though the employee said he'd left on an earlier bus. They asked me to describe him. I did my best. Average, everything, nothing distinctive. The kind of person you'd forget immediately. One of the guards went to check the men's restroom more thoroughly. He was gone longer this time. When he came back, his expression had changed. "Mom, can you come with me for a second?" I followed him to the men's restroom. He held the door open and pointed. Inside one of the stalls, taped to the wall, was a photograph of me, printed on regular paper. The image showed me from behind, walking through the terminal entrance, dragging my blue suitcase, my grey jacket visible. The hospital logo on my bag clear in the frame. The timestamp in the corner of the photo read 4:03 in the morning, 23 minutes ago. The security guard asked if there were cameras at the entrance. The employee checked the system. There were cameras, but they weren't recording. Budget cuts. They were just for show. They kept the photo. They filed a report. They told me they'd review what footage they did have from other areas, but the man hadn't used a credit card for a ticket, and there was no way to identify him. They moved me to a different area to wait for my bus, somewhere with better lighting and closer to the counter. One of the guards stayed nearby until boarding. I got on the bus when it finally arrived, found a seat near the front, kept my bag in my lap instead of in the overhead compartment. I didn't sleep during the ride to Lexington. I kept thinking about the lock sliding open on its own, about the shadow that didn't move, about the note describing my belongings in neat blue ink, about the photograph taken 23 minutes after I arrived, printed and taped inside a bathroom stall before I ever walked into that restroom. I still don't know how long he'd been waiting there, or if he's still waiting somewhere else.